There's a free app there that's completely changed the way that I've learned language. And to be specific, there's a specific setting that comes built into this app that's changed everything. It's made it so that I never have to learn the same thing twice. Now, the app is Anki, of course. You probably already know that. And the setting is called FSRS. And I'll explain to you how this works in a second. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the way that I used to learn language. So years and years ago, what I would do is I would make a whole bunch of small index cards. I don't have a good example around here for you, unfortunately. What I would do is I would take standard size index cards. I would divide them up into four sections of relatively equal size. And I would write whatever I was learning on one side and write the equivalent in English on the other. And then I would walk around with these cards and just use it to study. And I would do this every single week. It would take me about an hour or two, I would say, on Saturday evening to make new cards. And then I'd have them, go over them a couple times every day and call it good. Now, this worked well, except there was no way to review. My review was to make new cards for things that I'd learned before but had forgotten. That's basically the way that it was. This is where what they call spaced repetition software really comes in handy. So when I'm talking about spaced repetition software, I'm not just talking about Anki. There's a whole bunch of stuff like this out there. There's stuff like RemNote, Quizlet, SuperMemo, Brainscape. There's also this program you've probably never heard of called RapidWrote. That's what I used when I was in the Foreign Service Institute learning Korean, however many years ago. That was like 17 years ago, something like that. Now, anyway, these programs solve the old flashcard problem, which is that you don't wind up with like a huge house full of flashcards that you're like, what do I do with these, right? Instead, it will organize the cards for you. It can make them digital. Most of these programs are basically like SQL systems. They're databases, which means that it can tell you if you have the same thing in twice. And a lot of them have the ability to figure out if you got the answer right or not, and to adjust the frequency with which you're seeing a certain word. The problem with these algorithms is that they don't reflect your own memory. So what do I mean by this? What I mean when I say they don't reflect your own memory is that the way you remember or forget things is really unique to you. So what happens to me all the time is I'll be going through my Anki study and I come across a word and I've forgotten it. Maybe I knew it like 3 weeks ago and today I forgot it. And so I got it wrong, right? Sometimes when this happens, I see the same word again, like maybe 2 days from now or something, and I got it right this time because I just saw it. I remember it. But sometimes I forgot the word today. Maybe I see it again in 2 days and you know what? I forgot it again because I didn't learn it right the first time or because I just plumb forgot it, right? Maybe it's just hard for me. So this is the reason why I use Anki. It's not just because Anki is free, but of course, yeah, being free helps. No, the reason why I use Anki is because it can reflect the way that my memory actually works. So this thing I've been talking about, this feature within Anki, is called FSRS. This is the Free Spaced Repetition Scheduler. So to explain how this works, let me explain to you how these other systems worked. And we're going to go all the way back to the index card example. So back then, let me talk about when I started learning Chinese 20 years ago, right? I was in college. I did the same thing I did as a missionary learning German. I made a whole bunch of those small index cards. Now, with Chinese, I would do two things with the cards, right? I would go from Chinese to English on the one side, and that would involve looking at what the characters were and saying how to pronounce it and what it means. And then I would do it the reverse, right? So I would look at what the pinyin was and what the meaning was and have to write the character down, right? So that way I could learn how to write the characters and how to recognize them. Plus, I'd also learn sort of what the word is and how to say it and so on. And then after I did that for a certain amount of time, I would just declare myself done with the card, and that was it. There was absolutely no review process. In fact, I would wind up making the same card over and over and over again because I didn't really learn it the right way to begin with, or I would come across the same word in like a different context or something like that. And at my most extreme phase, when I was at the Foreign Service Institute, I had thousands upon thousands of Korean index cards just like sitting around. Most of them were illegible. You can ask my teacher about that because she looked at them with me, and many of them had many major mistakes. So you can see why I prefer the digital solution. Now, like I said, this old system had basically no review structure. When I started using Anki back in 2015, I got used to this new system that at least had a review structure. Now, traditionally, Anki worked with 4 buttons. You had again, hard, easy, and good. Now, in the old days, these three answers on the right, which is hard, easy, and good, those are actually right answers, and that includes hard. Good is the traditional answer for when you got the card right and pushes the card out by a certain number of days with a little bit of randomization thrown in to keep it interesting. Easy, of course, pushes the card out even further since you found it really easy. Now, hard also pushes the card out, but you have a little bit less of a push out. It means you got the card right, but you had to think about it first. And again means that you missed the thing completely. Now, Anki kind of would model your memory using this system, sort of, but there was one big problem. That problem is something that we call ease hell. So you see, the way that Anki used to work is it had this thing that they called ease. It was like a stat that went with every card. Now, ease would start at a certain number for every card by default. And the number is kind of arbitrary. It was something like 2.5 or whatever. Whatever. Anki would then reschedule the card after you gave it an answer based on which answer you gave it. It would raise the ease, saying that it was easier, especially if you hit easy, or it would lower the ease rating if you said it was harder or if you just got it plumb wrong. So if you mark the card easy, Anki would stick the card out by a long interval because the ease would increase a lot. Mark it as good and the ease factor would stay the same. It would still mean that you see the card like a certain interval away, but it would be like the next week or something instead of like a month later. If you marked it as hard, the ease factor would decrease. You would still have the card pushed out, but it wouldn't be pushed out as far as it would if you hit good. And if you marked it as again, the ease would basically go all the way back to where it was at the beginning. So if I got a word wrong like I did here, the traditional system meant that my ease factor would decrease substantially because I would have to learn the card all over again. Now, when I started with Anki, I thought, hey, this is a great thing. I figured that it would be good to be really disciplined and to keep learning the same word over and over again to get it in that long-term memory. But it turns out that there's a better way. So this thing called FSRS came in after some people who seriously studied memory started to get involved with Anki. These are people who were looking at what academics had to say about the subject. For example, they looked at this paper written by Robert and Elizabeth Bjork with UCLA back in 1992, that's a long time ago. The idea that they had is that information you learned has something that they called storage strength. As time goes on, the retrieval strength of this information, the ability you have to retrieve it from storage, would diminish if you didn't use it. The information's there, but you have a hard time pulling it out. But the information is still there, which means that if you pull it out, you can still have the information there. Maybe you start pulling it out again, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I remember what this is. Yeah, now I've got it. I remember this. So in other words, if you have a card in Anki that's wrong today, it would be ridiculous for the ease to go all the way to the bottom, right? Maybe it should dip a little bit, but not all the way. That's the reason why they came up with FSRS. Now, FSRS consists of three components that go along with every single card. You've got difficulty, which is a rating about how difficult this card is for you. So FSRS figures out difficulty by what you do the first time you see the card and every subsequent time. So if you get it wrong, it's going to be a little bit harder. There's also stability, which is this number that measures how long your memory is likely to last about this item, card, or whatever before it fades. So this is a number, and it basically is the count of the number of days before the odds you have of recalling the card successfully drop. And then there's this thing called retrievability, which is the probability that you're going to get this card right today. Now, the thing is, all three of these numbers change depending upon what you do when you see the card. And the best way to explain this, obviously, is to just show you an example. Okay, here's a card in Taiwanese Hokkien that I struggle learning not how to read, but rather how to write. This is the word ding sun, and I hope that I said that right. If I were using the old Anki algorithm, marking this card wrong would mean that I would see it literally over and over and over again, even if I started to get it right. Now, if I'm using FSRS, if I got this card wrong yesterday, but I got it right tomorrow, for example, the card would become a little bit easier after getting it right tomorrow, but not a super amount. If I then got the card wrong again the next day, the card would become a little bit harder. But it wouldn't necessarily go all the way back to the beginning every time I got it wrong. In fact, with FSRS, the truth is that the card in Anki is scheduled around my memory, not around some random algorithm. In other words, it adjusts the ratings for this card based upon how well I do when the card comes up. Now, this is one reason why it's so important to optimize your Anki presets every now and then when you use FSRS. It's because optimizing the presets is basically changing what the default is for every card you have in that preset type. In other words, it means that when you have a new card come along, Anki knows exactly what it means if you say this is hard or that this is good. Basically, what the people who made FSRS did is they had a whole bunch of data from something like 20,000 people and like hundreds of millions of these memory review sessions to see how their memory works. Now, these numbers that come along with FSRS, these tell you things like how much stability grows, how much a lapse hurts you, how difficulty and stability increase, and a whole bunch of other things that are like the guts of how the system works. The thing is, though, that FSRS will update these default numbers based on your answers as you go along, as long as you optimize it. And it will update different defaults for different presets that you have. So the best way to do this is to organize your deck up into logical presets. In my personal experience, I have these organized according to the different languages I'm studying, because some languages I happen to know better than others. Anyway, this is the reason why FSRS is so helpful and how it can sort of mirror your own memory. It's sort of like a language learning cheat code in a way, because it's organizing things around the way that your memory actually works, and because the more cards you go through, the more it understands how things actually work for you. And this is one heck of a lot better than using index cards, that's for sure.